the large component of this, which is pro bono. And then the second part is like, hey, you know what, we're a UX analytics company, we're doing pretty well, and I think that when that happens, we have both like the opportunity and the responsibility to start asking what great UX is. And up to now, everyone, when they talk about human great UX, they're talking about UX that is seamless, that's personalized, and so on. But what about a world where UX is also accessible to people of all abilities, sustainable in terms of eco-design, trustworthy, where we integrate data ethics and privacy immediately into the design of any experience. And so those branch out into the three core pillars in Contentsquare. My scope is a little different from a lot of other from CSR in the sense that all of those have North Star metrics, and in order to pursue them, we can do anything from modify the product roadmap. That means under that you have product, you have M&A, you have professional services. Also look into our own, so another part which we call responsibility, where we can look into our own policies, our own practices, and how we do things. There's philanthropy as well, which is we're starting and looking into how we give, how we engage as citizens. And then in the very middle, you have what I call identity, which ties into culture, our mission, our brand, and also our bylaws. We do follow ESG things because, of course, the more formal aspects of ESG, for example, third-party certifications, standards, compliance, and so on, but it's seen more as a layer than as what drives impact as a whole inside Contentsquare.
So you mentioned accessibility. If I understand, you all recently launched a digital accessibility nonprofit. Can you talk a little bit about that work?
Yeah, sure. So, this happened about a year ago, actually, before I came. And, Jonathan, our CEO, had, met this incredible entrepreneur who was also dyslexic and had started a company actually entirely dedicated to digital accessibility. And I think it was at that moment that we had this aha moment in a sort of negative way. We realized that we had been potentially contributing to the problem in the sense that we were trying to improve digital experiences all over the world, and inadvertently had been contributing to this world where we're locking people out. And I think this is a conversation that, I was listening to the previous panel, this is a conversation that we've all had when it comes to diversity and inclusion, where we didn't realize, to what extent we've been part of the problem, and we're all learning how to be more inclusive, how to be more anti-racist, and so on. And that moment happened for us for digital accessibility as well. So, Jonathan did what Jonathan does, which is that he acquired that company. Part of them fueled our product roadmap and started all of our strategic research and thought on how can we be better at this, both as a company, as a product, and so on. And there's an entire part actually of that company that was specialized in building products more for consumers, which we don't do because we're B2B. And so what Jonathan did is that he spun it out into a foundation. So that created the base of what we call the Contentsquare Foundation today, which is our foundation, which is entirely dedicated to digital accessibility in the world, specifically in investing in the next generation of change makers in digital accessibility. So we fund innovators that are working on open source programs, as well as researchers that are working to push the boundaries of the space of digital accessibility.
Very good. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of your recent work. I understand Maanch recently put in for its B Corp certification. Mm-hmm. Which I know sometimes that itself can be a bolt-on check-marking exercise. How did you make sure that this was, a non-evil B Corp?
Yeah.
A be better B Corp? What do we?
For us, sort of as we, sort of were in our first year, we sort of went for B Corp pending, which is for startups. So it was important for us because we felt like it is that outward signal really. To sort of the general market. It's becoming increasingly recognized. In the UK, it's one of the biggest growing communities of B Corps. And I think for us it was important because it really made sure that sort of our internal governance and everything was in place. We knew what we should be setting up for ourselves as an organization, and that would all be in place from the word go. It is quite a lengthy process. It probably took like 2 weeks of solid, just head down work preparing the applications. And then I guess the challenge with B Corp pending is a year later you've got to go through the process again to show that once you're a little bit more established as a business that you actually, sort of have implemented some of the things that you said you would be implementing. And then obviously in 3 years' time, so now for us, I think it's next year, they'll do their check-in to sort of just make sure that our score is still high. So yeah, for us really, it's just about really sort of doing what we're saying and also what we're teaching. We think that the B Corp principles are great, and it really it does just help identify you as that sort of business that's doing good. And also from the sort of shareholder perspective, it's about also taking into account all of your stakeholders, not just shareholders. So even embedding that from the start means that all investors investing in us will know that, we're thinking about all stakeholders along the whole journey.
Shareholders versus stakeholders is a good lens to look at this. My next question on this list is, how do you measure success when a lot of the things you're trying to track and to change and improve don't fit into that traditional little table at the end of every company's quarterly filing or a traditional balance sheet? Yeah.
So for us, sort of we think of like key indicators around people. So internally, what does our organization look like? What, sort of diversity is important. We're quite a diverse organization. We also look at, sort of what opportunities there are for growth, like satisfaction of our own staff, mental well-being, like things like that we try and measure, and that's also what we talk to organizations about measuring. Likewise with, sort of some of the planet sort of indicators. For us, we're relatively small and our carbon footprint isn't huge, so that hasn't been a huge challenge for us. But for organizations that we talk to, there's some, sort of challenges around how they can, sort of manage what they're doing and change their operations and in order to sort of improve better in terms of their planet score. And then I think also sort of one of the things that we're aspiring to is thinking about ourselves, almost talking about like impact under management and positive impact under management. So if we're a platform that is helping organizations to sort of track, measure and report their own impact, it will be great to see we've got like so much impact under management, and this is how we are helping to contribute positively to the SDGs. So that's quite aspirational. We need to obviously have a lot more, sort of organizations using our platform, but that's something that we really aspire to.
And yes, for you, Kat.
So for us, something I think that, so prior to this role, sorry, just some context. Prior to this role, I was actually in government. I was I worked for the Macron administration, and I directed this thing called the French Tech, which is essentially, headquarters for France's startup strategy. And, we put in place indicators on what impact should be. We had these whole conversation. We were thinking of putting them in place for growth stage companies. And to be honest, now that I am the chief impact officer in one of those sort of unicorn companies, I understand now I understand after 3 painful months that there's a distinction to be made, especially at an operational level, with the indicators that you're tracking, sort of like your North Star metrics and so on, which we have. So for example, for accessibility, it would be number of pages and sites that become accessible directly or indirectly thanks to Contentsquare. For DEI, I can tell you that the North Star metrics are on inclusion and belonging based on engagement surveys, but also diversity based on, especially the exec level, based on based on all of our people metrics and so on. But as a CIO, I can tell you those aren't the things that I'm tracking on a day-to-day basis. Because the hard part really isn't so much the what should we do, it's the how. So let's say you do want to get to, 50% of your entire leadership team with women, for example, and you're not starting there. The thing that the metrics you actually have to be looking at are less, the thing at the end and more what is actually causing this. Is it happening at the pipeline level? Is it happening at the hiring level? Is it happening at the promotion level? In what functions and what types of roles and what geographies and why? And so I think there's that distinction. And the second thing I also want to bring up, as a company that, like I said, is not, unlike Sianne's company, was not born to focus on ESG. I was listening to the panel earlier, and they were talking about the business case around impact, which is great. But as a chief impact officer, and for anyone who's hiring a chief impact officer, I gotta tell you, I have 0 KPIs when it comes to revenue, when it comes to thought leadership, when it comes to marketing, when it comes even to compliance. So essentially, the KPIs that reflect impact have to reflect the fact that impact is an end in itself. You essentially have 3 types, I think, of ways of looking at this, right? Like when you're a company like ours, you can think of impact as a portfolio of initiatives, like sort of company pursues its existing strategy and roadmap, and on occasion will maybe plant a few trees and have a speaker over for unconscious bias, for example. You have the second one where impact is really a tactic. It's a series of tactics that serves the existing strategy, which is pretty much like a revenue-driven strategy. And that's why you'll hear all of these arguments that, impact is really great when it comes to say like, reputation, to employee engagement, to risk mitigation. And the previous panel, they were also talking about optimizing operations. And then you have the third one, which is the one that we really believe in, where impact is an outcome in and of itself. And so actually, you're speaking about how we report on this and how the metrics look. Impact is actually directly integrated. All of the North Star KPIs that we have is directly integrated into the company's main dashboard, into the board reporting, into how we report quarterly as well.
So I've been struck in your talk and your focus so far on consider what your input and output is on so many levels, and how it sort of clashes a little bit with the traditional Silicon Valley startup ethos, which is get going fast, pivot if you must, and don't worry about externalities. It reminds me of years ago, I was talking to some startup founder at Demo, this was that far ago. I told him, your privacy policy is terrible. He said, oh, that's the placeholder. We needed that to get into the App Store. We'll do the real one later on. To what extent is that still an obstacle when you're looking at clients and they're still focused on keeping themselves open for the next pivot, whatever that might be?
Yeah, good question. I think it's around also coming down to sort of like Hat was talking about, the sort of mission, the values, and the sort of purpose of the organization. And I think that's critical. And if you can start there, then it's around sort of breaking it down into things that are really achievable. So where can we sort of start? What's like most important for us now? And it's about creating that like sort of internal culture, I think, and alignment, saying this is how we want to run our business. And then I think from there you can sort of obviously build more layers as you go.
Right on. Let's now pivot ourselves. The biggest crisis in Europe is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has exposed a whole lot of, speaking of externalities, the natural gas people use to heat their homes and cook their food, where money goes, who is in whose supply chain. How has that changed up your job as chief impact officers?
Do you want to go first?
Well, sure. Change is a funny word. So, disclaimer, I have actually only been Chief Impact Officer of Contentsquare since December. So, progressively creating the role as we move forward.
December
and
feels
actually,
like it was 2 years ago, though.
It does, though. It definitely does, for sure. And one of those sort of pivotal moments was actually when the Ukraine crisis hit and the war broke out and Russia invaded. And, it was one of those moments where I realized that there was a component in my job that we hadn't thought of before, which is that, sometimes, you have a whole decision-making process in a company to determine when something is right and wrong. And it's usually based on decision-making that has to do with what's good for the business, what's bad for the business, or what's legal and what's illegal. And suddenly we were walking into a completely different type of question that was being asked at the exec committee level is, what should we do? You could just follow compliance on what should be done, right, and decide to just sort of stick to the measures of the countries in which you're geographically based, or you could open up a conversation. But then you open up a conversation and say, like, for companies that did go into philanthropy and donations, do you do direct donations? Do you do gift matching? How do you justify that you're doing it for this particular cause and not for others? We have people in our team from 13 countries all over the world. Like, how do we articulate that If we do this, do we create a precedent? And if so, how do we open this up later on and use this actually as a way to just expand philanthropy across the company? If we hadn't earmarked or budgeted any of that, how do we decide then how much every year we put in place for something like this? What's the decision-making process? Do we pick three, do we pick only vetted nonprofits, like just the 3-4 really obvious ones? Or do we let our employees give to whoever they want? And, and if that's the case, then how do we do due diligence and things like that? And I mean, these may seem kind of like no-brainers for a lot of, corporates that have been doing this for a very long time. But this is something that we were doing, we were doing for the first time we had been like really confronted with something like that. And as Chief Impact Officer, my job was really to make sure that there was as much clarity as possible, that everybody had the material that they needed to make the right decisions, to make them as quickly as possible, and to make them with as much confidence as possible, and to sort of lead that discussion as well, along with the Chief of Staff.
I think those are, all really interesting challenges definitely that come up. It's the governance around giving, and as you say, like, do you have a strategy in place, and then how will that, sort of run over years potentially? And it's really about thinking about that and setting that structure in place. If you have a foundation, what does that look like? How do you involve employees? And then what is the overall business line, and how does that meet up to, what your vision is, what your purpose is? For us, because we work directly also with not-for-profits, it was an opportunity to just sort of really, leverage some of our relationships with organizations and sort of create that sort of access so that corporates could also access not-for-profits that we'd done due diligence on, that we knew well. And I think interestingly, we were having conversations, like, for example, with asset managers who were saying, "Ooh, okay, this is what our ESG line is, and these are the kind of funds or companies that we're investing in. What should we be thinking about now?" So some of it took a bit of like an advisory or just a sounding board perspective. And then interestingly, I think on a different level, which was touched on before, it's really shown the interconnection again between different things. So food security, looking at renewables, like bringing all of these to the front. I think that's been one impact which has been positive, making us think about these again. And on a personal level, one of our employees was based in Kyiv. So it was just, sort of, we'd obviously been checking in with her all the time, and she was like, "Oh, we're fine, nothing's going to happen." And in the morning, obviously, when they shelled Kyiv, we were all, chatting to her and saying like, "Oh my God, are you okay?" And she was just like, "Well, we think we're going to leave," and just sort of made her way.
Probably a good idea in that case.
Yeah, made her way to the border, and we've actually brought her over to the UK now. So I'm pleased to say that she's safe, and she's actually. Her and her family are living with me, and they arrived on Tuesday, so we know that she's doing well. So it's been quite a, sort of, I guess, on that personal level, knowing someone and, sort of trying to help them has also been pretty intense for us.
So last question we have here, what is next for your companies?
Yeah. So for us, we think this is a really exciting space. The impact space, that's, sort of who we are. And it's really about, trying to make impact accessible for all organizations. Just by virtue of existing as a company, you have impact. So I think it's around really thinking in that way. And that's what we really want to do, is we want to make it like really easy for all companies to be able to show what their impact is, to be able to articulate that well. So what's next is really, sort of developing our tech more to automate this space. We know this is, because it's data intensive, a lot of this is still done manually on spreadsheets, questionnaires. So how can we, sort of make this space a little bit cleaner, and sort of just easier to navigate, and also really just helping them to create those impact inclusive decisions by investors, by companies, and also creating a bit more of that autonomy, so that companies feel like they're in control of, I guess, their ESG ratings.
All right, you get the last word, Sianne.
Yeah, I think for us it's and then again, right, this is the beginning of my journey inside Contentsquare, and then also really the beginning of Contentsquare's overall journey for impact. And I can tell you that's something that I am absolutely obsessed with. is team design and operations. And I think it's because, when you're not doing this job day to day and you don't see what it takes to change, both in terms of effort, in terms of design, in terms of cost, you think that, hey, if companies aren't doing this, well, clearly it's because they're the bad guys, Clearly it's because they're against it. Like, clearly, they hate diversity and they hate the planet and, all these things, right? And now that I'm inside it, I'm actually seeing, this is what it's going to take. And so a lot of my focus so far has been on structuring the team properly. It's something that we're doing is hiring out VPs for every pillar, for example, that I just mentioned. So I have diversity, inclusion, digital trust, sustainability, and digital accessibility. Strengthening the entire foundation team as well. And then for each of the VPs, they all come with sort of senior program leads. And the idea is to have them working as CEOs and COOs because, contrary to a lot of other companies, we're not in run mode, we're in build mode. So they have to design it from the ground up as though, versus run it as though it's an existing project. And then there's also learning how to work with all of the different departments and functions inside Contentsquare, which is super important because you say if let's say we could set an objective for, let's say, gender parity. Let's say we want to set gender parity for the entire product house, right? The entire product team and the entire IT team, the entire tech team. And even if everybody agreed on that, you would still have to take into consideration the special recruiters that you would have and the resources that you would need for that and everything that would go into into sort of recruiting. You would have to take into consideration the fact that you would be late on your hiring and therefore be able to model how late you are and what the consequences are on that, what the consequences are on the product, what the consequences are on the roadmap, and be willing to take them. So I feel like now that I'm kind of understanding really the interdependence of what these decisions mean and what the cost is and whether we're willing to take it and how to handle it, that's been kind of our sort of focus at this time to make sure that we set it up right.
Excellent, very good. Thank you both for your input. I hope this has enlightened you all about the other CIO's job. I hope you also appreciate, I don't think either of you all used impact as a verb or an adjective the whole time. That's great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.